Welcome to episode 87 of Anchored in Education. I'm E. Scott England, and Anchored in Education is the podcast dedicated to all things education. Educators across the world routinely engage in conversations surrounding fundamentals, concepts, and new ideas that improve this great profession. Sometimes we agree, other times we disagree. But at the end of the day, we are all anchored in education. Writing is something that we all do at some point in our lives. I mean, it is kind of hard to navigate the school scene without writing. Writing standards begin as early as pre-K when students express their desires less with written expression but rather verbal expression. But even these early formative years set the stage for writing development over the course of the next 13 years of primary, elementary, and secondary schooling. Now, for some, writing continues post-secondary, while for others, it might end as people enter the workforce. But it begs the question, does it really ever end? When I have a home inspected, a report is written. A mechanic writes a report on the latest noise my Jeep is making. Writing is all around us. But how many of us have uttered the words, "I am not a writer"? If I can be completely honest, I've said those exact words less than 30 days ago, and writing is like nearly half of what I need to do in my position. My guest today is Julie Bogart, founder and creator of the Brave Writer program. Brave Writer is an online writing and language arts program designed for the homeschooled child. Most importantly, though, Brave Writer is designed to capture the writer that is in all of us. And spoiler, regardless of what you think about your writer ability, you are in fact a writer. Julie, welcome to Anchored in Education.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, absolutely. Now, hey, before we get started, we'd like to find out maybe a little bit more about you and how you became anchored in education.
Thanks for asking that question. You know, back when I was young, in my early 20s, I had the ambition of living abroad. And I got married and discovered that many of the people that I got to know there, many of the families, had selected homeschooling as a way for them to educate their children. They didn't want to put their kids in the public schools because it was a different language, whatever. And it was the first time I had ever heard that language. I didn't know that the word home and school could be used together and have any meaning. This was 1984. So once I had this sort of bug in my ear, I started doing research into education. And what I discovered really tickled me. I had a fantastic public school experience, but what it was grounded in this innovative educational practice of the 1970s in Malibu Canyon of Southern California.
Yeah.
So it was immersive, it was active, it was kinesthetic, it was driven by students' ingenuity and passions. And I had watched schools change over the ensuing decades and decided that homeschooling was going to give me my best shot at giving my kids this alternative experience. An education that they valued, one that catered to their passions and their interests and their skills. So that's how I first thought about homeschooling, and that's how I got started as a home educator.
Okay.
My first year was 1991, and I home educated 5 of my kids for 17 years.
Wow. And so we're gonna talk about Brave Writer today, but real quick, can we just talk about 17 years of homeschooling and how that went with 5 children?
Yeah. So for me, it felt pretty natural. I moved from being their sole caregiver during the day to continuing to be their sole caregiver as they were getting their education. What I really love about homeschooling is the way that it creates a family culture of learning.
Okay.
So the lines are blurred around when education is happening and when play is happening and when family time is happening. So what we experienced was just this rich, curiosity-driven lifestyle. That's not to say we never had any arguments over finishing a math problem, but it was more around this experience of literature and experiments and using our bodies and not just being confined to a schedule or a desk. So that really laid the groundwork. All 5 of my kids are adults now. They're successful in all their own ways. My oldest son became a self-taught computer programmer, has a great career today, and 2 kids. I have a daughter who is living in Mexico, traveled the world for 2 years on her own as a single woman, is married with a child now, is a life coach, and headed to grad school next year. I have a son who works for the human rights arm of the UN in Central Africa.
Wow.
And that he went to Columbia Law School. And then I have another son who is a self-taught IT professional who studied at a great books institution. So has a classical education and then taught himself IT. And then my youngest is just completed her master's in marriage and family therapy in California. So they've all found their way. They've all picked careers that matched both their aspirations and their temperaments. And I think that's the beauty of homeschooling, is it puts kids in touch with that they can be and do whatever they want because they have the power of self-educating.
Absolutely. And, the thing is, I'm a product of public school, and I taught in public schools and was an administrator in public schools, and I have a son in public school, but I also have a daughter who is homeschooled. And so the thing is, it's not that she wasn't successful in public school. She absolutely was, but she's driven differently. And so she has been able to sort of take control of her learning. And for some it works, for others it doesn't. And so I think it's absolutely relevant that we have you on today to talk about that, because there are a lot of homeschool options out there and everything else. So today, we're talking about Brave Writer, and now this is the online writing and English language arts program that you're the creator and the owner. And so, to me, it seems that writing ranks right up there with people who say they aren't good at math, because too often we hear, "I'm not a writer." I'm sure you've heard that, but you contend that everyone is a writer with a fascinating story to tell. It's just a matter of bringing those amazing thoughts out of the minds and onto the paper. So can you maybe expand on this idea for our listeners today?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we talk about writing, a lot of times we have school memories, and the school memory is that we have to be taught how to handwrite, how to spell, how to create punctuation that is accurate, how to build a paragraph, how to write an essay. So when we think about writing, we're actually thinking about a bucket of skills that I would prefer we called something other than writing. I wish we would call it transcription. Because the truth is, we are becoming secretaries to our minds. We are learning a set of skills that help us take the invisible thought and make it visible and reproducible for a reading and interested audience. But when we focus on the transcription skills as the gateway to our own ideas being on a page or on a screen, a lot of times we experience what I call a roadblock. By the time you're age 5, you are a fluent native speaker of whatever language your parents spoke in the home. So in our case, that would be English.
Right.
And that fluency actually transcends any other second language speaker of your language. The accent, the syntax, the use of grammar, even regionalisms get adopted as part of your fluency. But it is at that age that you are just being introduced to the alphabet for the first time. You're just learning how to read. And so what ends up happening is by age 7, 8, 9, somebody asks you to take these complex, multifaceted sentences with a deep, rich vocabulary and funnel it down through an arm and a hand onto a page before you have mirroring fluency in transcription. As a result, many students very early on develop writer's block because what they feel is, I can't translate what I really want to say into the level of reading and handwriting skills I currently have. So I need to dumb down the content of my thoughts to match my slowly developing transcription skills. And it is during this very crucial moment in a child's life that a lot of damage gets done. a child takes the risk to use a word like cornucopia or serendipity in their writing, they misspell it. And a teacher who is sort of governed by the idea of accuracy more than power in writing is going to find that as a flaw, mark it down, and the student suffers as a result. They end up with a lower score or a lower grade or a sense that what they were trying to communicate isn't valid until it's properly spelled. So when I say every person's a writer, what I actually mean is the interior life of all humans is worthy of preservation in writing. Here's how I know that's true.
Yeah.
When you have a baby and that child hits a year and a half and says their first word, what is the activity most parents take? They jot it down in a baby book. They send it in a text message to their mother. They immediately record it in writing. Why? To preserve and protect the oral language of their beloved child, the thing that bubbled up out of them that was original to them. That is the beginning of that child being a writer. You do not need transcription skills to be a writer. Stephen Hawking has proved that to us. People who suffer from any kind of hand impairment, I know there's a whole category today with technology who have repeated stress injury or they have other hand limitations. We can use voice to text. We can hire a secretary. We can ask our mother to write it down for us. So what is writing? It is actually the interior life of a human being externalized and then encoded by someone with transcription skills, whether it's a computer or a human. In school, what we're trying to do is close that gap so that we can transcribe our own thoughts accurately. But that journey takes 10 years from 8 to 18. So it has a heavy burden associated with it if we expect accuracy too early from our very thoughtful, original thinkers and writers.
Wow, a lot to unpack.
I know. That's a long answer.
Well, but the best thing about it is, as our conversation goes, I believe we are going to unpack more of what you just said. But I want to go back to a couple things. Number one, if you don't mind, I am totally going to use Secretary of Our Minds. Because
love it.
I absolutely loved it. That got me excited when you said that. The other thing, and I just want to clarify, when you talk about we have all these words in our head and then we're supposed to transcribe them and send that message down to our arm and we hit that roadblock. Are you saying, are you suggesting maybe that's where we get the idea that we're not a writer because we're not making that connection?
Correct. And it starts so young. Unfortunately, kids who are barely reading yet and starting to move the pencil or the pen to do the alphabet, they are juggling sort of on, if you think of the brain as like desk space, they're using the majority of their desk to sort through the alphabet. Which direction does the D or B go? Do I use CK or do I use KE? They're asking those questions while they're trying to remember their thoughts. It's very easy for adults to forget what that feels like because we're so fluent today. But when you're young, you're making those judgment calls simultaneous to thinking thoughts. And eventually those two wires get crossed and suddenly you can't remember what you wanted to write or you can't remember how to spell it. And your mind does a triage in that moment. I'm just going to write it the way I know that it sounds and hope for the best, or I'm going to change the word to something easier to spell and downgrade the power of what I wanted to communicate.
You know, what gets me as I'm listening to this is that, you know, we have these roadblocks and these thoughts then on our inability, our perceived inability to be a writer, and how that just sticks with us to where, you know, now we have adults or we have college students. You know, I'm in higher ed, so I hear adults. I'm not a writer.
That's right.
I can't do the dissertation. You're in a doctoral program. You're going to have to. but I mean, it's just those thoughts that are still with us, you know, 10, 20, 30 years later, you know, could have possibly have taken on a different tone had we had a different approach to our writing and the science behind it.
1,000%. In fact, I taught at the university level as well. And back when I was first working in my writing career, one of my jobs that I did freelance was to coach dissertations from PhD candidates. And what I would do is help them actually externalize their best thoughts. Because what would happen a lot is they could articulate in a short paper or in a conversation or orally, but when they faced the page, the paralysis that hits is if I'm not accurate, what I have to say isn't important. And yet the way that we stir up the writing life is to say that what you have to say is important. Accuracy is secondary, that punctuation, that spelling. I like to teach writing by teaching students how to handwrite and how to spell using someone else's thoughts.
Okay.
So we do a practice we call copywork and dictation. This is common practice in France and the continent of Europe. Not as common in the United States, although our early founders were raised with copywork and dictation. Basically, the practice is this. You take a text, like let's say Little House in the Big Woods by Laura Ingalls Wilder or Trumpet of the Swan by E.B. White, and you take a passage and you put it in front of a child, and their only task is to accurately recreate it in their own hand. Initially, they will go letter by letter, space by space, period by period. That's called copywork.
Okay.
Dictation then is later in the same week, giving the child a blank sheet of paper and now reading that passage aloud. And the child is listening for syntax and intonation that helps them indicate punctuation and to think about spelling. But guess what's missing? Original thought. So what they get to do is give full attention to thinking about how to structure and represent these thoughts in writing without also thinking of the original thoughts. So as they're learning to practice spelling, handwriting, punctuation, and context, they are mirroring or mimicking the exact same process they have to go through when they are thinking a thought. But this is like a graduated step on the way there.
Wow.
And it's highly effective. And then eventually they just borrow those skills right over into their original writing.
Oh, this is exciting. And we're going to get more into that in a second. But I want to go back to Brave Writer for a second. It has 8 values: affirming, protective, committed, creative, believing, non-sectarian, investigative, and diverse. So I'm wondering if maybe we can take a minute to explain more about these and why the values are important to the program.
I would love to. Yeah. What do you want to go one at a time?
Yeah, let's
How
just
do it.
Let's go right down, starting with affirming.
Okay, that would be great. So when we talk about children as being writers, as we have been, I think the number one gift we can give our children is to let them know that they were born writers. And we do that by writing down their words for them before they can handwrite or read. So we affirm to our children that their inner lives are valuable enough to transcribe, preserve, and read again. One of the practices that I recommend in Brave Writer all the time, and by the way, this can be done with a teenager, not just a 6-year-old.
Yeah, right.
Is to listen for a spontaneous moment where your child is absorbed in speech. So for instance, you might be stir-frying dinner. In runs your 7-year-old son. He says, Mom, Rocky was chasing a squirrel in the backyard. And you suddenly notice, oh, he's into a story. I want you to turn off the stove, grab a pen and the back of a supermarket receipt or an envelope, and just start jotting down the exact words that child's saying. If it's a teenager, wait till they're arguing with you, about why they should extend the curfew. The second you notice that they're impassioned, start jotting it down. Now that child or teen is going to say to you, Mom, what are you doing? And it's at that moment that you say, this is so good. I'm afraid I'm going to forget it. So I'm jotting it down. Keep going. And really value that oral communication and put it in writing. With the young child that night at the dinner table, sit down with the family and pull this piece of writing out. You don't have to call it writing. It's obvious that it was written. Yeah. And simply say, Sean was telling me about Rocky chasing the squirrel. It was so good. I was afraid I was going to forget it. So I wrote it down, but I just want to read to you what he was telling me and read it back to the interested audience of the family. In fact, if your child is young, under 12, You can throw it in with the library basket of books and read it to your child over the next several weeks again and again. And they start to realize, oh, a writer lives inside. For that teenager that you were arguing with, after you've jotted it down, and that teen might even say something like, stop writing, Mom. And you could say, okay. When they leave, jot down as much as you remember, and then come back a few days later and say, you know what? I was really reviewing what you said, and I'm really interested to further this conversation. So here are the things you said that I jotted down for myself. Did I get these right? When you start doing that, what you're doing is you're showing this teenager that the way that they think, the logic they build has merit already before they've ever learned the essay format.
Wow.
And that you are going to engage with them around their ideas and their logic, not just around their format. Because then when they get to the format, they'll actually have something to put in it.
Okay.
So affirming them as writers through valuing their writing, their speech.
I love that idea, and that can really help out, in your example of the dinner table later. How many times is our dinner met with silence, or it's driven by adults because the children, well, I don't have anything to say. Nothing happened important today. But to be able be able to go back and say, oh, but wait a second, there was this story, and let me retell it. How wonderful. Now we move into the next value of protective.
Yeah, so I'm very protective of the parent-child relationship. Too often, we end up putting our goals for our children ahead of our children. So we want them to go to college. We want them to get an A, instead of valuing the experience of being a child who's living under the pressure of performance. So what we like to say is that we want children and parents to find a rhythm that honors both ideas, the uniqueness of the child and the goals of the parent. And that requires sort of a vision for where the child is going, but empathy for the hard road it is to get there. And so we create inside of our program all the kinds of tools and activities that actually enhance and support a parent-child connection, not just better writing.
Okay. And, you said something there that I think that it's important to highlight to parents and just adults in general to recognize, because I don't think we do enough. Maybe like we acknowledge it a little bit, but don't we take it serious? And it's that children, regardless of age, but especially when we get into those teenage years, are stressed. And there's a lot of pressures on children that I'm sure if we reflected back on our own life, we had similar pressures, but we tend to forget those. Like once we reach adulthood, then we're like, well, I made it through without any problem. But, looking back, there are a lot of pressures. And so I love that the protective piece is built into that. It has to be able to make, I guess, the program less threatening on, or less pressure to students. I'm guessing that was the design behind it.
For sure. It's also to help parents manage their expectations, right? One of the ways that you facilitate a better relationship with your child in any aspiration is to understand what they're capable of and what it feels like to be them in that context. So even if they're an athlete, the traditional dad who's a coach and son who's supposed to be the star, the pressure and the tension and sometimes the cruelty that result from these competing aims is something we're trying to avoid. And we do it in school. We do it with schoolwork. So if we can create that nurturing bond and actually give effective tools, I really think that part of the reason the dynamic gets kind of messed up in the parent-child relationship is the tools aren't good. Mm-hmm. If the only tool you have is a red pen, and your child is afraid of being corrected, there's no chance for a better relationship. But what if the tool says, we're going to work on your mechanics over here using somebody else's writing. But then when you're doing original writing, I don't care how it's spelled. I don't care how it's punctuated. I'm here just to understand your mind life. We're going to think about spelling and punctuation later, but we're going to start with the raw material of how amazing you are and how much you think. And then we're going to enrich and expand it through these big, juicy conversations and discover together what more is hiding inside you that I still don't know about. That's kind of the outlook that you need for this process.
Oh, sure. My mind's just going crazy with how we can apply this in so many different ways and bring out that writer. But I'll stay focused for right now. So the next value is committed.
Yeah. So we do want our students to have writing success. And I felt that I needed to include this in the values because whenever I emphasize trusting imperfection and relationship, people think we're a creative writing company. They're like, oh, sure, you can do that if it's just for fairy stories. But what about the research paper?
Right.
The truth is the research paper takes as much creativity as a story. Creativity is at the heart of all writing. It is generating from scratch from inside of a body. And so we are committed to the experience of your writing being successful, not just indulged. And so that's why I included that as one of our values.
Okay. And so then that can segue into creative, and we can talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. So when we talk about creative writing or being creative, what we want to imagine is sort of like creating the universe, right? It's like scientific, not creativity like the arts.
Okay.
So what I mean by that is there is a generation process that every body goes through, first to speak and then to write, or in this case, think, perhaps speak, and then write. And that creative process is unique to the person, and it requires a certain amount of research, gestation, experimentation, risk-taking, modifying, revising, researching again, rethinking again, cutting and pasting. There is an actual journey to this creativity. It's not just, oh, I want to write fairy stories, or, oh, I'm all about poetry. It's bigger than that. So that's what I mean when I talk about creative.
Okay. And our next one is believing, and I'm interested to hear in how believing has one of the values of Brave Writer.
This is probably the key value, in my view. One of the ways that we understand children in Brave Writer is that they tell the truth about themselves. So if they say they hate writing, we believe them. If they say they don't want to write, we trust them. If they say a certain exercise is stupid, we accept their opinion. We start with children where they really are, and we say to ourselves, you can't shock me. The reason for this is that children so often are treated as though they are irrational beings. But for them to take the risk to expose their insides to you in writing or even in talking, we have to start with the idea that what they're telling us feels true to them in the moment, even if they're excuse making or covering up some deeper truth. You know, sometimes we call it lying, but a lot of times kids are testing the waters.
Sure.
You know, I don't want to do writing. It's boring. Well, maybe it's not that it's boring, but they use boring because it's safer than to say something like, I don't want to do writing. I'm afraid I'll fail. And then you won't like me as well as you do right now. I remember my son, Noah, my oldest, his father was a composition professor and I was a freelance writer. And so I was giving him lots of opportunities to write without making any errors, without worrying about errors he was making. And he still felt writer's block. And when he was in about 6th grade, I said, tell me more. What's really going on here? And finally, tears came to his eyes and he said, I know you tell me that spelling and punctuation don't matter in free writing, but you and Dad are professional writers, and I feel like you'd like me more if I got them all right. Even after all of the space giving, because we don't know how much our children want us to be proud of them. So we need to create space for them to tell us their truths, and then we want to meet them there. So when he said that, I said, wow, that is a lot of pressure.
Back to the pressure.
I think that's right. That's a lot of pressure. And so what if today you do writing, but I don't read it? You just get to practice writing and nobody's eyes will be on it. And he thought that was a great solution. So that's what we did for a while.
Yeah.
We just wrote, nobody read it, because guess what? Writing growth happens.
Yeah,
it doesn't happen because I looked at it. right?
Absolutely. And in talking about the ultimate safe space of writing,
Yes.
and everybody is getting accomplished what they want to be seen. I mean, your son's getting to write. He's getting to write with the knowledge that it's just for him. Nobody's going to see it. Everybody wins in that with that safe space. So, I absolutely love that. Now, the next one I think is important because especially when we talk about homeschooling programs, some people automatically may draw conclusions as to what kind of program it is. So the next value is non-sectarian.
Yeah, that's been really important to me. So homeschooling originally began in the 1970s with a quite diverse group of people committed to alternative education, particularly in California. But to legalize homeschooling, the initial cases that were presented in courts used religious freedom as the base for the right to home educate. And as a result, homeschooling really took off in Christian contexts. They had the infrastructure through churches, and there's a very natural evangelization value in Christian contexts. And so homeschooling really took off. So during the 1990s, early 2000s, 99% of the homeschoolers in America were Christian. But we were seeing a beginning of more secular and other religious backgrounds joining homeschooling in those early years of the 2000s and late 90s. So when I started Brave Writer, I wanted it to be for everyone. I wanted to be a place where religion was not the top priority, but education was, or non-religion. I mean, we welcome secular and religious to the Brave Writer space, and we support families in self-expression. So if your students are in my class and you're Muslim and your daughter wants to write about Ramadan, we will support that. If you have a conservative Christian who wants to write about some biblical story that's meaningful, we will support that. If we have a secular student who wants to write about the origins of the universe according to Dawkins and Sagan, we will support that. So Brave Writer actually becomes a place for diverse thinking and critical thinking as well.
Yeah, and I think that we can begin to see how the values are interwoven as well, and being able to, in that non-sectarian piece, be able to create that safe space in which we're not confining everyone to write about the same topic, which is typically what we see in writing classes, especially early on. Everybody write about this, and maybe you don't agree with that. Maybe it's not something you're comfortable with. And so you can definitely see how the values begin connecting and interweaving with each other. And that takes us to investigative.
Yeah. So when we write, we need to write from having a well of research, experience, and depth in a topic. And so investigative symbolizes the notion that thoughtful questions develop the best writing. I've written a recent book called Raising Critical Thinkers, which is the fruit of so much of my thinking over these last 2 decades. What I've noticed is that the best writing comes from people who adopt that academic disposition, the capacity to hold and look at multiple viewpoints simultaneously and to consider them on their own merits. One of my favorite education reformers, Paulo Freire, he says that each student does not come to school with an empty mind or an open mind, but with a full mind filled to the brim with their backgrounds, right? Yeah. Their experiences, their families, their culture, their economics, their religion or non-religion, their political values. They bring those to the table, and our thoughtful investigation of the relationship between our identity and what we're studying creates or generates the insight that makes thoughtful and amazing to read writing.
And whenever you're talking about the investigative again, I just think of how relevant this is to just society right now.
Yep.
And in fact, before I came over to the studio, I was reading something a latest political pundit has put out there, and I constantly ask myself, why do I continue to read this? But it's one of those things that if we empower students to have that investigative piece now, and sometimes challenge our own beliefs, and I've had a great conversation with a colleague even today on things that's if you were to present it to the community, you would have the clashing back and forth. But I think a lot of it is because we're rooted in maybe it's our implicit bias or whatever it may be. But what a great way to acknowledge that and then explore a little more. I think that I'm understanding the investigative piece right there.
Yes. The bottom line is, I want us to raise children who keep their curiosity. When I was doing research for my book, one of the startling and disturbing pieces of data I discovered is that children, when they enter school, have what we might consider 100% of their curiosity and imaginations available to them. By third grade, it's diminished by half. And by sixth grade, it is all but extinguished. They are being trained into thinking that the job of a student is to find out what the authority in the classroom says the answer is, and then to give that back to the authority. Whereas investigative questions say that we can pose our own curiosity to the subject matter. So if a teacher is teaching multiplication, and we all think, oh, I know what multiplication is, it's memorizing times tables. But I, a student, never understood that multiplication actually was a shortcut to addition.
Yeah, right.
Did not know that the word multiplication meant multiples till I was 34. Like, that's when it all hit me. And I had many questions about multiplication. I'll never forget this one rhyme that a teacher gave from the front of the room about dividing fractions. It says, yours is not to reason why, just invert and multiply. Yours is not to reason why, just invert and multiply.
Wow.
That is how we divide fractions. I needed reasons.
Yeah.
That's the only way anything sticks in my brain. I'm not a follow practices person. I'm a process-oriented person. So when we think about investigative, then what we're talking about is developing relationships to subject areas, to our identities, to our curiosity, because that's what creates the best writing and the best education.
100%. I agree with you there. And then the last value is diverse.
Yeah. So we live in an era where we are finally valuing all the voices in the room. And we are not saying no to any of them. We are saying it's important to read about protagonists that don't look like me and ones that do. Yeah. One of my favorite descriptions of how to evaluate your library bookshelves at home, your little home library, is to look at the titles and see which ones are mirrors and which ones are windows. Mm-hmm. Mirrors allow you to have your own experience reflected back to you in ways that help you generate insight and feel seen and known in the world. Windows allow you to look through to somebody else's experience so that you make greater room in your mind and heart for the way other people think and live.
Oh, wow. Windows and mirrors. Now I'm going to have to go back and look at my home library.
Yes. You want a balance of both, right?
Yeah. So as a professional writer, you will be the first to say that to teach writing should focus on the writer. Now, as a father of 2 children, I know how difficult it is to get my children to listen to me. Right from the beginning, we learned that, quote, Brave Writer is designed to enhance the parent-child relationship through the teaching of writing. So let's spend a few minutes talking about how important peace and progress are in the writing process.
Yeah. So from the beginning, your child needs to know that you're their ally, not their teacher, not the homework enforcer. And there are a few ways to do that without saying the words. One of them is don't stand over them. When they're writing, sit next to them. Make eye contact. Before they start writing, talk to them about what's going to happen. I know you've got this assignment and it probably feels tricky. Tell me a little bit about what you might think would be fun to write about. I could take some notes for you. Do you want me to jot down your first few sentences to get you started? Maybe let's shake out our hands, roll our head around on our necks. I can rub your shoulders. What pen feels good? Do you want to test 4 or 5 pens before we start? Oh, yeah. Just to get the one that feels good? In other words, if we're going to create a relationship with an editor, we need to feel safe with them. And a parent's input is not valued if they are only seen as the person who's going to show them what they did wrong. So we start by creating a context for writing to occur that feels safe and nurturing.
And so, okay, now as I'm listening to you, Julie, I'm going to put myself in some listeners' shoes real quick, because here is what I'm sure listeners are saying. Julie, that sounds great, but I know my child. You don't know my child. And so can we hear, some testimonies on parents that have come back and been like, maybe they were doubters, and maybe they were doubters and have come back and said, you're absolutely right. This, we have enhanced our relationship.
100%. I mean, I've got thousands of those actually. But let me start by explaining it this way. Kids are really smart, and they know when you have an ulterior motive. And an ulterior motive is evident when you are manipulating your child. So if you're there saying, I'm going to try these techniques that Julie is suggesting to ensure that my child writes, that is not the same as entering into an unknowing. We are going to explore writing and discover what there is to be known here. If my child starts and then suddenly tears come to their eyes, I'm going to be curious about the tears, not angry that he's not still writing. If my child writes a sentence and I think it's bland and dull and beneath what he's capable of, I'm going to start by noticing what's good in that sentence. So let me give you an example. Imagine your child has been asked to write about roller coasters, and your child's super excited, loves roller coasters. He sits down, he writes, roller coasters are awesome. I like going on them every summer. My favorite ones are at Kings Island. I can't wait to go back. Roller coasters are the best. And you're like, that is not a descriptive paragraph, right? Like that's every parent's feeling. Like that is not a descriptive paragraph. But here's the problem. The child is actually into roller coasters, and there's so much to say. They just start using what I call label words to get it out. So there's all this like better language hiding behind one word. Roller coasters are awesome. So you go back and you read that. And what I would say to my kid is, they are. Tell me more about awesome. And I'd get out my pen and I'd start jotting down the words they say. Well, they're awesome because they're fast. How fast are they? Do we know? Oh, I think they're like 60 miles an hour. Which one are you thinking of? Are you thinking of the loop-to-looped one? Should we go look it up? Let's find out how fast they are. Okay, I wrote it down. So this is how fast they are. What else is awesome about them? And we start guiding them, coaching them in how to do the deeper dive, not just blaming and shaming them for only saying awesome. Awesome was the only word they could come up with under pressure.
Right.
But now you've got time. So we stop and we actually engage the dull sentence, and we dig deeper and show them the path for how we access more language. We can say things like, tell me about one ride. You've talked about all roller coasters in general, but let's pick the last time you were on a roller coaster.
Yeah,
let's
it specific.
Go step through step. Yeah, what was it like when you got on? What did you smell? How did it sound? How crowded was it? What were you thinking as you were going up the click, 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 click? Right?
Yeah.
But we need patience. That's why I said, here's what we hear from parents. Once they start using our tools and asking these sort of investigative questions that draw more out of their children feel loved.
Oh.
They feel loved. Can you imagine how wonderful that feels to have the full focused attention of a parent who's interested in the detailed experience you had and wants to know more and gives you the floor to say it?
Yeah.
It transforms it from writing to connection.
Wow.
And when you feel safe and connected, you want to say more. And so then what I hear is these kids are walking around the house writing, and then they come back to their parents, wait till you read this, because they know the parent will be interested in the interior of that child.
Oh, and what a great setup for the next one, because there's a lot of work that goes into Brave Writer on the parent side as well to get to this point to where you're asking. And so, as I was kind of doing my research on this, I've tried to remember back to when I was instructed on writing. And it was a lot of mechanics of writing and the structure that went along with it. And you sort of alluded to this at the beginning, but I vividly remember in high school writing instruction telling me how to write an essay, and it must consist of 5 paragraphs. And,
Right.
it was, so then I was just counting. Like I knew, okay, a paragraph is at least 3 sentences. I need at least 5. All right, 15 sentences, bing, bang, bam, I'm done. Now, can you explain, though, how this impedes on writers from finding their own voice? And then what is a better route to writing instruction?
I love that you brought up the 5-paragraph essay. It is such the subject of debate in the whole world of academia. When I taught at Xavier University, the colleagues I had just hate that format. They thought it stifles writing voice. It keeps students from being in touch with what they have to say. I, on the other hand, actually think that the 5-paragraph essay is almost like training wheels for the academic mind. And when it's taught that way, it can really be valuable. This idea that you make an assertion, you support it with points, you identify particulars that support those points, and you show students how to find those. It's like teaching them architecture before they build their own building. But here's the problem. When we teach format absent of writing voice, we get back what you just talked about, kids fulfilling the requirements without investing any of themselves. And this is why I really believe that in the early years, between ages 5 and 12 or 13, the focus needs to be on stirring up the active, persistent, quirky, funny, personal voices of children so that they discover that thinking is enjoyable. Writing is just transcribing your thoughts. If thinking is not enjoyable, writing never will be. And thinking is the source material for powerful writing. By the time you're in high school, if you are comfortable with thinking and self-expression in writing, you get that format and suddenly it's like a brand new car to drive. Like, wow, what does this one do? How can I play with these tools and make it really cool? And that's what I felt about writing. When I got to high school, the academic formats for me were like power tools. It was like going from a handsaw to a power saw. I'm like, this is awesome. Now I sound really good.
Yeah.
But if our kids don't experience that connection early on, then that just feels like a straitjacket. I'm just going to guess what I think the professor wants me to say. I'm going to count my sentences and I'm going to stick it in this weary, drab essay format. And then the professor or the high school teacher is either going to just grade you based on the format, knowing no one would ever want to read what you wrote, or they're going to grade you on the content and tell you it's insipid and lifeless. You can get an A on bad writing if you have a teacher who only grades on format and mechanics.
Right.
You absolutely can.
That's a true statement there. And, I'm trying to also think of what my practices are and if I need to change them as a professor. But, one of the things I try to avoid on a lot of, especially if it's reflection pieces, to not put guidelines on there because it's a reflection piece. But the first question that always comes back to me is, but wait, how long does this have to be? Are you looking for a page? Are you looking for 2 pages? Like, no, it's a reflection. If you can, if you feel comfortable reflecting and putting down all your thoughts in a half page, then that's your reflection. But if you need to go out more, but it's amazing that even still the first question is, but what are you wanting?
Totally, because of a grade-driven system, which actually is one of the advantages of doing Brave Writer online classes or using our products. There are no grades. Dr. Peter Elbow, do you know him? He was a professor from Amherst in Massachusetts. He's the most respected composition sort of innovator over the last several decades. He's in his 80s now, but he was super popular in the 80s and 90s. And I have formed a friendship with him over my work because I've drawn so heavily from what he laid out ahead of me.
Yeah.
And one of the things he said that he loves about Brave Writer is that there are no grades. He said, Julie, for decades, I have been trying to get students to become interested in their inner lives and to put that in writing. But because grades were attached, they always had to know format, length, what my expectations were. And he said we would try to do some ungraded writing inside of the class, but they never valued that as much because they knew it didn't help their grade. He said, whereas what you're building is a context where the writing itself is valuable, and the grades are not attached. And he's like, I can't wait to see how it works out. Right? Like there's the laboratory. And we've been doing this now for almost 23 years. And we have seen over and over that kids become proud of what they produce.
Oh, sure.
And it doesn't have anything to do with whether or not they got a grade on it.
Well, and listening to, I mean, at least from my personal experience, we have to be careful on rubrics as well, because rubrics are well-intentioned, but a lot of times the underlying is that they're tied into that grade. And so then we're still not allowing that freedom of expression, and we're just, trying to align what our product is to what the rubric says.
I think to your point earlier, when you said a reflection piece, a lot of students have not been guided in how to reflect meaningfully. So when I was teaching at Xavier, one of the things I did before each lecture or new unit of lectures is we would do a free write where we would take a sheet of paper, 8.5 by 11, and turn it landscape. And then we would fold it in half and then all the way into eighths. I'm doing this for a podcast. I don't know why.
Well, I can help it for my elementary teacher. She folded it hot dog style.
That's right.
Yeah, and then folded it two more times.
That's right. And so it's like quadrants, right?
Yeah.
So there's or eighths. What are they? Octants. I don't know what they're called. I'm not a math person. I'm a writer. But in any case, what I would do is I would select maybe 6 or 8 terms that were going to recur in the next unit before I did any lecturing. And I would have them put those at the top of each quadrant. And then we would free write for 2 minutes on each quadrant. What does this term mean to you? So I taught theology at Xavier. So in my very first class, we would do belief, religion, faith, spirituality, God, Bible. I would just put these terms because we all are coming from these different backgrounds.
Yeah.
We're coming from different assumptions. We're coming some from a Christian heritage, some from an atheist, some from a Jewish, some from Muslim. And what do these words actually mean? So that when I'm lecturing and we're actually engaged as a class, we're suddenly aware that when we say the word faith, it means very different things. And so when we read this author, now we need to know what their definition is, because it is probably not mine. And by starting to teach them how to do that reflection, they start to have thoughts to put in a paper. I also did another activity with my students where I would take the reading and I would shrink it and photocopy it onto sheets of paper with extra wide margins. And then as a class, I would show them how to ask meaningful questions of a text in the margin and how to annotate their thoughts as they read. And then they would turn these in. I would ask them to turn in their annotated thoughts. So it would be things like, before you begin, based on this, chapter title, what do you think this is going to be about? Right? Mm-hmm. And then we get into the first paragraph. Is this matching what you thought it would be about? Underline every word you don't know. Now go to a dictionary and see if what the dictionary says about that word seems to fit the context it's being used in here. Keep going. Ask a question. Wow, I really hate what this writer is saying right now. It makes me feel like I'm not a good person. Where does he get off saying that? I said, that is a very good annotation for a piece of writing that you're reading. And as you engage between the affective, how it makes me feel, and the more objective or academic approach, trying to understand, you're creating the dialogue that generates insight. Hans-Georg Gadamer wrote The Art of Interpretation, years ago, a century ago. And I took his tool and I rebuilt it for a modern user for high school. And I actually put that in my book, Raising Critical Thinkers. And it's all these ways of looking at a text. What does it expose? What does it hide? What vision is forecasted? What vision of the future is foreclosed? Who is it for? Who is excluded? These are questions that students don't know to ask. So when we ask them to reflect, they don't know what that means, right? Because they have not been taught. So that's the kind of thing I wish was going on in high school. more than the 5-paragraph essay, because until you know how to think, writing the essay is going to be a wooden exercise in dead, lifeless sentences.
Oh, well, that's a great way to summarize it. Now, Julie, before we go, we've talked a lot about bringing out the writer that is in all of us. Specifically, we're talking our children. Now, what approach should one take if their child is already a great writer, but now they're looking to take their writing to that next level?
I love those kids. I will say this right out of the gate. Parents of reluctant writers and parents of kids who are great at writing feel exactly the same feelings, that they're not doing enough for their children. It's amazing to watch that. So just know that going in. For those kids who love writing, though, you have to do very little. The number one thing to do is to supply them with writing instruction by professionals. And Brave Writer is built from the professional writing model. My mother wrote 72 books in her lifetime.
Wow.
She's still alive, but she's retired now from writing. And what I noticed from the way she instructed me and taught her students is that she was interested in readers. Education models focus on grades. So if your child loves writing, focus on readers, not grades. Get them readers. Go to Kindle Publishing and publish their little book and give it as Christmas gifts to all the relatives. Sell it on Amazon. Take it to the local library and see if they'll stick it in the library. I have heard, by the way, that some libraries will do that. What you want is to help them make their writing as real as possible. Should you go in and edit all of their punctuation and spelling errors? Nope. Ask them if they'd like you to, but honor them as an author. Give them total authorial control and put them in as many writing contexts as they can be in. National Novel Writing Month in November every year is fabulous for kids. There's a young person's version of that. Taking online classes with Brave Writer. We have classes in fiction and in all kinds of fantasy writing and fan fiction. So if they are looking for a place where they will be received and nourished and encouraged, that's also a great place to go.
Oh, sure. And I'm thinking too, as long as the privacy concerns are addressed, that starting your child out with a blog and
fabulous.
And letting them, even if it is a blog to talk about going all the way back to the beginning of our conversation, the stress and pressures that students feel, that children feel, what a best way to help out another student is to say, here's someone your own age going through exactly what you are. But it gives them that publishing platform that can reach to so many.
100%. And today, kids are already writers. I love to tell parents this all the time. If we look back at the history of humanity, more human beings are writing today than in the history of the world.
Yes.
And more children are writing today than in the last even 100 years.
Thank you, social media.
They're texting, they're doing social media, they're in their online gaming chat rooms. They are using tools like blogs. I remember my daughter, my youngest, when she was a freshman in high school, she did a fashion blog every single day for a year. And it involved writing and research and sense of humor. Here's what today's young people have going for them that I did not.
Yeah.
They have built-in audiences. So they are learning to write for readers from the time they can use technology. And those kids who have access and take advantage of those chances are my best student writers, hands down. They're funny, they're insightful, they know how to keep the reader reading. And that's what we want for our kids.
100%. All right. The program is Brave Writer. I'm going to put a link to your website on the Read More link today for today's episode. And then also, let's get a link to your book, again, Raising Critical Thinkers. Is that correct?
Yes. Yes, that's the one.
We will get a link to that as well. Julie, thank you so much for joining us on Anchored in Education.
Thank you, Scott. I so enjoyed this conversation.
It has been fun. Now, you can find Julie on Instagram at Julie Brave Writer. You can also find her on Twitter, though that handle is just at Brave Writer. And of course, visit the Brave Writer website at bravewriter.com. Before I wrap up today's episode, don't forget to head over to my website, escottengland.com/podcast, and click on today's episode to learn more about Julie. And don't forget, if you have not yet subscribed to Anchored in Education, make sure you do so on whatever platform you get your podcasts. I am so glad that Julie of Brave Writer was recommended to me as a potential guest. I am in the unique position in which I have 2 children, one who attends public school and one who is homeschooled. Of the many great things that make children special, their uniqueness has to be at the top of the list. What works for one will not always work for all. Anchored in Education is dedicated to providing a platform for all ideas, programs, and innovations that support learning. Brave Writer fits that perfectly. Writing is such a magical form of expression. We need to have strategies to get what is in our head out onto paper. You will even hear the importance of this next month when one of my guests talk about how important journaling is. Julie has created a program that allows parents and children to seamlessly navigate the natural frustrations that come with writing. Whether it is a homeschooled setting, public school setting, or private school setting, we need to be delving into practices that elicit the writer that is in all of us. We can't expect students to continue to learn writing in a cookie-cutter fashion. That's not best for schools, and it sure isn't best for students. And remember, at the end of the day, we are all anchored in education.